Picture this. It's 4 a.m. on August 16, 1945. The tropical air in Java is thick, it's humid, and it is charged with tension. A nation's founding fathers are suddenly and forcefully abducted in the dead of night. But here's the twist. They aren't taken by their colonial oppressors, and they aren't captured by an invading army. They're actually kidnapped by their own people. So you have to ask yourself, why on earth would the youth of a budding nation point guns at the very men trying to lead them to freedom?
Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into what is essentially a living, breathing historical thriller. We're going to reconstruct the chaotic, bloody, and fiercely debated birth of the Republic of Indonesia. As you'll see, this is a story packed with midnight gambles, massive power vacuums, and desperate, high-stakes alliances that literally reshaped the 20th century world.
Okay, to really understand the stakes here, we have to look at the terrifyingly rapid sequence of events that just shattered the Pacific. In basically a week, the dropping of 2 atomic bombs forces the absolute surrender of the Japanese Empire. And almost overnight, this massive administrative and military vacuum just opens right up across the Dutch East Indies. Suddenly, nobody actually knows who's in charge. Now, this geopolitical earthquake instantly ignited an explosive internal conflict. On one side, you have the old guard, leaders like Sukarno and Hatta. They wanted a cautious, structured transition through a Japanese-sponsored committee, mainly because they were terrified of triggering a violent crackdown by the fully armed Japanese garrisons that were still stationed there. But on the other side, you have the Pemuda. These were the radical, armed youth, and they knew that if independence looked like a Japanese gift, the arriving Allied forces would just crush it as a fascist puppet state.
Section 1. The Geopolitical Power Vacuum.
3 months. That's it. That is literally all the time it took for the Imperial Japanese Army in early 1942 to completely obliterate over 300 years of deeply entrenched Dutch colonial rule. This was a psychological earthquake for the Indonesian people. It proved that European imperial dominance wasn't some unchangeable law of nature. It was fragile, and more importantly, it could be broken. But behind those sweeping changes was a staggering scale of human suffering. Just look at the human cost. During the 3-year Japanese occupation, up to 10 million forced laborers, known as Romusha, were mobilized. And we're looking at a horrific death toll of 4 million people, mostly from famine and brutal exploitation. So this wasn't just a simple change in management, right? It was a period of profound agony that forged this absolute, unyielding desire for self-determination. They could not and absolutely would not go back to being a colony.
Meanwhile, operating completely in the shadows, figures like Sultan Jajir were running these underground anti-fascist networks. The very second he intercepted those crackling, illicit foreign radio broadcasts detailing Japan's surrender, he rapidly mobilized his youth network. The order was simple, but incredibly dangerous. Prepare for an immediate revolution.
Section 2. A Life on the Line.
Let's zoom rapidly back into the frantic psychology of our opening standoff, because the stakes here are literal life and death. Fearing that Sukarno and Hatta's hesitation would cost them their one and only shot at a legitimate republic, radical youth activists kidnapped their own leaders. They dragged them to the rural town of Rengas Dengklok. The goal was twofold: sever them from the influence of the Japanese military and aggressively pressure them to declare independence as a popular revolution right then, right there.
And the way this standoff was broken is just astonishing. A senior figure named Akman Subarjo travels out to the youth stronghold to negotiate the leader's release. And he doesn't just ask nicely. He makes a literal life-or-death wager with the youth militia commander. Subarjo promises that if independence isn't declared by noon the very next day, the youth could put him in front of a firing squad. He literally wagered his own life on the birth of his country.
With that incredible guarantee in place, the leaders rushed back to Jakarta that night. But think about it. Where do you draft a treasonous declaration of independence in a city that is still crawling with Japanese troops? Astonishingly, they did it right under the military's nose. They met at the residence of a sympathetic Japanese naval officer, Admiral Tadashi Maeda. It was this frantic, clandestine midnight session, trying to balance soaring idealism with the terrifying pragmatism of the moment.
You know, history is full of these incredibly fragile human accidents, and this is a perfect example. After the official version of the proclamation was typed up, Sukarno's original handwritten draft, the literal, authentic genesis of the Republic, was crumpled up and tossed into a trash can. No joke. It was only because a sharp-eyed journalist named B.M. Dia secretly fished it out of the garbage that this priceless artifact even survives today.
And that brings us to the climax. 10 a.m. on August 17th. At his own residence, Sukarno stepped up to a microphone. With those simple, powerful words, the Republic of Indonesia was officially born. But, as we're about to see, declaring independence is one thing. Defending it against an empire coming to take it back, that's another story entirely.
Section 3. The Blood of Surabaya.
We've got to shift our narrative now from the tense, shadowy political maneuvering in Jakarta to the brutal military realities that followed. When British-led Allied forces arrived in Java, supposedly just to disarm the Japanese, they brought Dutch administrators with them who fully intended to reclaim the colony. In the city of Surabaya, this ignited an absolute inferno. The disparity was just staggering. You had a modern, battle-hardened Allied military machine with 24,000 troops, Sherman tanks, and warships facing off against fiercely determined but vastly outgunned Indonesian youth militias wielding whatever weapons they could scavenge.
The British response to the uprising was absolutely terrifying. On the very first day of their major counteroffensive, in November 1945, they rained 500 bombs onto the densely populated city of Surabaya. It was an overwhelming display of industrial slaughter, designed to shatter the Republic's spirit instantly. But here's the thing, that spirit didn't shatter, it hardened. For 3 grueling weeks of bloody urban warfare, the Indonesians fought street by street. The sacrifice was immense. Over 6,000 fighters died, and tens of thousands of civilians perished in the devastation. This wasn't just a battle. It was a crucible that forced the world to acknowledge the devastating price Indonesians were willing to pay for sovereignty.
And this is exactly why Surabaya matters so much historically. Even though the British technically took the city, the sheer, sacrificial bravery of the Indonesian resistance shocked the world. It completely shattered the Dutch narrative that the Republic was just some small, unpopular fascist cult. It proved to the British and to the newly formed United Nations that Indonesia actually had massive popular support. The international community had no choice but to take them seriously as a nation.
Section 4. The Black Armada Boycott.
As gunfire echoed across Java, let's widen our global lens for a second. This struggle for freedom resonated in some really surprising places, forging international connections you rarely hear about. Down in Australia, dock workers heard the shortwave radio broadcasts of the Indonesian proclamation. Viewing it as a shared fight against imperialism, Australian trade unionists initiated what they called a black ban. They straight up refused to load weapons or supplies onto Dutch ships heading to suppress the Indonesian revolution. They took to the streets, spray-painting walls with "Diggers support Indonesians." It was an incredible display of cross-border working-class solidarity.
And this wasn't just some nice symbolic gesture. The boycott completely paralyzed the Dutch reclamation effort, grounding 559 Dutch vessels in Australian ports. By suffocating the logistical supply chains of the colonial army, these Australian dock workers directly impacted the survival of the young Indonesian Republic.
Section 5. A Sovereign Nation Born.
Through a combination of fierce, bloody resistance on the ground and unprecedented international pressure, we finally start to draw this violent narrative to a close. The Battle of Surabaya and the guerrilla war that followed proved the Dutch simply couldn't win a purely military victory. What followed was an exhausting, 4-year war of diplomatic attrition. Ceasefires were signed, broken, and rewritten. From the Linggadjati Accord to the Renville Agreement, the Republic bled for every single inch of recognition. Finally, late in 1949 at the Round Table Conference, the immense cost of the war, along with mounting pressure from the US and the UN, forced the Dutch to unconditionally transfer sovereignty.
So what's the big takeaway from all of this? The Republic of Indonesia wasn't politely granted. It was wrested into existence through the sheer willpower of a mobilized population, an insane gamble on a midnight kidnapping, and the blood of its youth. It's a stark reminder that history is never inevitable. As you look at the geopolitics of Southeast Asia today, consider this. How does this legacy of radical anti-imperialism and hard-fought independence continue to shape how modern nations navigate global alliances right now? Keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you for joining me on this explainer.